Okay, so welcome back. Now, in this video, we're going to begin taking a look at Macbeth. Macbeth is probably the most widely studied text at GCSE level, so I think it makes sense to begin with that text. This should be useful for many students because there's a huge number of schools that select Macbeth for GCSE level. So now that we've looked at the contextual events of Shakespeare's own life, his biography, and then also the historical and political backdrop around his entire life, the first thing we're going to do with the play Macbeth is we're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to go through the same process. This video should be quite a bit shorter because it's a bit more focused just on a fairly narrow time period and just a few issues. So we're going to begin with these historical factors and some of these political and social factors as well that are, in the case of Macbeth, absolutely intrinsically linked to the text, and you'll see why as we go through. We have to cover some of the history here. Okay, so the first thing we're just going to quickly go through are the historical events that Macbeth is loosely based around. So in terms of setting, the play, we obviously have King Duncan, Macbeth, Malcolm, and so on and so forth. And those characters are actual real figures from history. King Duncan was a king of Scotland in the 1030s, so 1034 to 1040. By all accounts, he was quite a poor king, was basically quite weak, didn't fulfill his duties particularly well, and he was disposed by Macbeth, who was actually his cousin. And Macbeth kind of took over and was basically a better king by all accounts. I think there was some kind of plot against Duncan just to get rid of him. So it's situated historically, 500 years before, in this time period. So many of the figures in the play, Duncan, Macbeth, Malcolm, several other names as well. When you read through the historical account of what happened with the real King Duncan, you see some of these names crop up. So there are some parallels between the text and the play. However, that doesn't really tell the full story at all. In fact, if anything, it's almost like it's almost a distraction. So the play is situated in historically at a very distant time period from the time at which Shakespeare is writing. And this is a kind of a common strategy that writers use. If they want to talk about something contemporary, they want to tackle something contemporary, often they situate the play or the book or the film itself in a different time period, in the future, in a different country, something slightly exotic to contemporary society. And that allows them to give an analysis of the current historical events and then also have that disclaimer, that kind of like, well, this is fictional, it's based in the past, you can see that. So it gives you a bit of a kind of plausible deniability as a writer or as a creator, and I think to this day creators still do that. And it's also just often more interesting and more fun to do things that way. So that was the situation with Macbeth. So we have a factual historical backdrop that is, something of an inspiration for the text. But we also have some other important factors as well. So as I discussed in the previous video, Shakespeare's life was kind of divided between the Elizabethan reign and the Jacobean reign. So Queen Elizabeth and King James. We've been through that history in the previous couple of videos, so I'm not going to go into all of that again. But one thing I didn't mention, and I think I should mention now because it relates to Macbeth, is the religious tension that was, a huge factor in Elizabethan and Jacobean England. So Elizabeth was the granddaughter of Henry VIII, who obviously decided that he would make himself head of the Church of England, when the Pope wouldn't grant him a divorce. So, that's how the Church of England started. And subsequent to that, Catholics were persecuted relentlessly in England. People had to swear an allegiance to the king or to the monarch. So this was, obviously very much about control and power. And Catholics, who were the majority, who did not want to, change their faith, were persecuted for a long period of time. And this was no different under Elizabeth. I think many people just decided, well, we'll just go along with this. What difference does it make to us? But there were obviously more kind of strict or religious people who didn't want to go along with things. And so Elizabeth was another monarch that made life very difficult for Catholics in England. So they were, if they had money, if they were landed, or they had some wealth, they were kind of often extorted, to be honest with you. So they had their wealth was kind of almost forcibly taken from them in some cases. No freedom of worship. They were not allowed to worship as they wished to. There was an element of tolerance that this could go on in private. They called it crypto. Well, it's now called by historians crypto Catholicism because it's hidden away. But there was no freedom of worship. And then obviously priests and so on, monastics, were more kind of directly persecuted, many imprisoned and things of that nature. So it was not a good time to be a Catholic. It was not a good time to be a person of serious religious faith in England. And this kind of builds up over time. So when King James accedes to the throne in 1603, he'd actually made some noises in the kind of run up to this that he was going to be more tolerant of Catholics, and he was going to go easy on some of these measures and persecution that was happening under Elizabeth and previous monarchs. However, he kind of reneged on this, he kind of folded on it. This was partly due to pressure from other kind of outside parties who wanted to turn the screw a little bit on Catholics. So it wasn't only King James who was involved. There are other kind of powerful parties involved, and so he did decide in the end to kind of reinstate tough measures against Catholics. So he took tough measures, and to an extent he went back, I won't say on promises, on ideas that he'd kind of been sharing. He went back on more tolerant ideas in his reign. So this is the whole situation, and we'll come on to this probably in other plays. Romeo and Juliet is a fairly obvious one, in which we have kind of slightly nonsensical conflict going on, and you can probably see parallels between what happens between the two families and then what's happening between the Church of England and the the Catholic Church as well. But with Macbeth, it definitely plays in to the action. It's kind of crazy when you think about it, that all of this really began with a divorce, with a mental king who, executed his wives and did all sorts, who just wanted to get divorced from, I think it was the Queen of Aragon, and the Pope wasn't having any of it. He said, no, you're not getting divorced from the Queen of Aragon. And he said, okay, well, I'm going to be the head of the Church of England. And thus this kind of this conflict began. It's crazy how these things work. And to such an extent that England became really a Protestant country after this, which it had been obviously a Catholic country, so it's kind of crazy. So we'll move on to the next big historical event, and arguably the most famous historical event in the popular kind of mind of this whole period. So after James succeeds to the throne in 1603, he, as I mentioned, goes back on some of these ideas of greater tolerance towards Catholics, and naturally this creates friction, it creates resentment, it creates an energy within the Catholic population that something has to be done. This has been going on for too long. We need to fight back. And in 1605, November the 5th, 1605, one of the most, if not the most famous assassination plots in history, frankly, in recorded history, was uncovered as Guy Fawkes was found in it wasn't the basement, it was like just a building under construction under Parliament, with all of this gunpowder, and basically the conspiracy, the gunpowder plot, was unravelled. Okay, so here we have the conspirators. I think there was maybe one or two more. The most famous ones: Thomas Percy, Guido Fawkes, Guy Fawkes, and Robert Cattleby. Okay, so these were the conspirators. We've got Guy Fawkes here, Guido Fawkes, as he was known because he fought in Spain. Thomas Percy and Robert Cattleby. So we've got these English Catholics who plot to rebel and to assassinate King James. And this was a serious attempt, and basically the scenario was that they were going to attempt to kill James and destroy Parliament at James's coronation. So this was a pretty bold event, to put it, pretty bold attempt, to put it mildly. And so what they did is they got lodgings in a building which had almost like in kind of a construction that went next to or under Parliament, and they were able to slowly move gunpowder into like the basement in like a specialized kind of area. And it was a huge amount of gunpowder they got in there. It was like 15 barrels, 12, 13, 15 barrels, something like that. Imagine a full barrel of gunpowder. So it was enough to basically just create an absolutely enormous explosion, and definitely enough to probably kill James, but certainly do just a massive amount of damage in this ceremony. I'm not sure about the positioning and things like that. There will be I'm sure there's some obsessive ballistics person who has really studied this, but I'm not sure exactly on what they planned in terms of the timing and so on. But the night before the attempt, so the night before James's coronation, where James and Parliament were due to meet, Guy Fawkes went down. He was to be the man who lit the touch paper the following day, so he was there to stay with the gunpowder, just keep a check on everything. And basically someone within this network had been discovered or had given information away, and the authorities came and arrested Fawkes. In terms of when the information was given away, there were some indications that actually several months before the king knew this was going to happen, or the authorities knew that this was being plotted. So I'm not sure how far this information got, but anyway, somehow it had leaked out, and Fawkes was arrested. He was taken away, he was tortured. He actually refused to give the names of his co-conspirators, which is pretty impressive given how savagely he would have been tortured. But eventually they were all found out. Cattleby and Percy fled. I think they got to York. I think they were arrested in York. One of them was shot in the head, and the other one was just arrested alive. And Fawkes and the other conspirators who were caught were hung, drawn and quartered, and a number of other things actually as well, which when you actually read how they executed people is kind of unfathomable, to be honest with you. So brutal execution, making a real example of them for this plot and for the intention to commit treason and regicide. So as you can probably imagine, things did not improve much for the Catholic population after the gunpowder plot. In fact, measures became even more stern and more strict. So it's an amazing episode in history, and it's definitely one of those big, what ifs. What would have happened if this had succeeded? You could argue it would have been the only successful English Revolution of the last 1,000 years, because this was more of a revolutionary act than it was an act of war and that kind of thing. So an interesting question, but it was stopped, and King James carried on his role. So it was a bit of a tempestuous beginning to his reign, but actually things did steady, and he, I think, pretty much had a successful reign, I would say. Now, just to come back to James with Shakespeare, I mentioned in a previous video that James actually basically had adopted Shakespeare's company, and when he acceded to the throne in 1603, and they became known as the King's Men. So they got this royal sponsorship, which was just like fantastic for them in terms of support and kudos, and to use the modern phrase, branding. This is a great endorsement for them. So Shakespeare has just had, the royal seal of approval. It's possible he met with King James. I don't know. It's not something I'd really thought about until now, but I think it's highly possible that he actually met with King James. Well, certainly he would have had some correspondence with him through, through whatever mediums were available. So Shakespeare now has this great relationship with the great power of the country, with James. This is just amazing, obviously, for his career. It's like it's almost like he's gone from being a normal playwright to kind of supercharge his career. If we look at the timeline, it's an interesting timeline. So we've got Shakespeare's rise during the 1590s under Elizabeth. We've got James's accession in 1603. Immediately, James gives sponsorship to Shakespeare. It's one of the first things that he did. I mean, obviously, he has many duties, but this is one of the things he did to support the arts, to support this burgeoning art. And very soon after James's accession, in 1605, we have the Gunpowder Plot. So this is like James is still in the honeymoon period here. He's only really just come to power, and already he has this massive assassination attempt against him. And then in 1606, Macbeth is first performed. And actually James did attend Macbeth. I don't know when he attended, but he did attend. So he actually saw the play. And when we think about the plot in Macbeth and the historical events of 1605, the Gunpowder Plot, there's a very obvious link, right? Just for a moment, just think about what that link is. What happens in Macbeth? Regicide, right? A king is killed. And this, is written in the immediate aftermath of an attempted assassination on the king. So in the play we have a real assassination, and in history we have an attempted assassination. And so you think, wow, that's interesting. So Shakespeare, just having been given a kind of royal seal of approval, he's writing a play about killing a king. That's the whole center point of the plot. I think seems a little bit mad. Why would you do that? Surely this would be a little bit of a sore point for the king, the guy who's just given you this great support. Maybe you would not really want to go there straight away, really. I mean, or ever, because you think, well, King James would be sensitive about someone trying to murder him, and it seems odd that the first play Shakespeare writes after this event is actually about the real killing of a king. So they actually succeed in Macbeth. Okay, and so you think, okay, well, how did James receive that? He went to see the play. How did James receive the plot? What did he think about it? And actually, he approved. He got like a royal seal of approval. Which again is interesting, because he just experienced this assassination attempt, and here he is watching a play created by a guy he's just sponsored, and the whole play is about killing a king. Seems strange. When we look at the political implications of the plot, the real implications of the plot, it's actually fairly clear that this plot certainly does not support regicide. Okay, so let's just think about this a little bit. So before the assassination, we have King Duncan. He is, by all accounts, a good king. He rewards Macbeth for his bravery in battle, and he also punishes people who betray him. And so we have this, rewarding the good, punishing the bad people in the kingdom. By all accounts, he's a decent king. And there is an element of stability and structure, and there's some kind of order within the kingdom when Duncan is alive. Now, if we look at the consequences in the play of the assassination of Duncan when he's killed, obviously Macbeth accedes to the throne. He becomes a tyrant, and chaos ensues, really. We have madness ensuing, Macbeth's own kind of mental disturbance, Lady Macbeth's own descent into madness and eventual suicide. We have Macbeth ordering the murder of many friends, courtiers, even children in the play, and then we have a kind of civil war as well, which ends with Macbeth being killed himself. So what follows regicide is chaos, destruction, death, madness. So all of these terrible things follow on from regicide, from the murder of a king. So the political implications are essentially like validating, they kind of validate, kingly authority, and also the stability and structure that is put in place by a king and by all of that structure. And in a sense, the plot is a warning against what may have happened had Guy Fawkes and the other conspirators actually succeeded. It's a warning against, revolution. It's a warning against, this kind of turnover and turmoil. So it's a warning against chaos and, regicide as well. So politically, it's a conservative play in the sense that if you were to draw a kind of moral of the story from the play, you would say it'd be something along the lines of people need to play their position within the structure. What they don't need to do is be super greedy and ambitious and destabilize the whole structure. People benefit from the structure that a king gives, so let's not kind of mess with that. I'm not saying that's what I think, that's the kind of rationale of the play. So when you think about the implications, the political implications of the plot, it makes a little bit more sense. It's not such a shock that Shakespeare actually put this out so close to the assassination attempt, and it also makes sense that King James approved, because it kind of validates his position, because it shows what could have happened had had Guy Fawkes and so on actually been successful. So this is a key event, and you may well wish to mention it in your analysis at some point, maybe on one of your questions with Macbeth. Certainly it's important to get a good grounding and to understand the historical context of the play, because the gunpowder plot, the writing of the play, and then the performance of the play are all in such quick succession that we have to address that, as well as obviously Shakespeare and James's relationship as well in terms of the sponsorship and everything like that. So that's a really key point of history that is related to Macbeth. Okay, so that's all I really wanted to go into on this video, just to give you a little bit of a specific historical backdrop to Macbeth. And in the next couple of videos, we're actually going to start to get into the play itself, so the plot, the characterization, and so on. So hopefully you'll join me in those. Okay, so I will leave you with that.